Hello, everybody. Glad you're back. Sorry that this episode started about 2 days too late. I ran into a bit of an issue with my computer and could not record it for Sunday's show. So sadly, I'm recording this on a Monday for what is for tomorrow's show. And some of you might already know or know that I basically went to a GT this weekend for Sparkle Death Party number 8 in Seattle, and then end up winning the entire thing with a Legion of Blood army. I had another topic to schedule this week to talk about, but I got so many emails and messages and DMs that about like how the hell does this list work that I thought I would actually like cover and explain all the combos in it today instead. So I'll push my original topic to next week, and we'll cover that on Sunday. So this is kind of like an kind of a more off the cuff show. So we're gonna do something I don't typically like doing too much, which is basically reviewing specific faction stuff. I like posting more newer list ideas and that concept on the channel if I could have, and not necessarily go too much into something that already exists. But I guess this army is so kind of abnormal and you don't see it very often, then maybe this is just fine. So anyway, just enjoy the ride, because this could be a potentially longer show than 20 minutes, which is my targeted segmentation time. Mostly because there is a ton of synergy and things that like players probably don't see it right at the top of the gate when they consider this army. And I know for that this could be potentially a very short-lived list since the new book is around the corner, but I doubt that the new book will change dramatically the way this army plays. The mechanics might change, war scrolls might change, but I think it might just be a very similar archetype that just will exist in the newer book effectively. So I don't have any knowledge about a new book. It'd be shocking to me if they fundamentally changed the core mechanics of this book with the new book. Anyway, let's delve right into it. So Legion of Blood. Before I talk about specifically the list, I want to cover some like things why Legion of Blood. Mechanically speaking, the reason why Legion of Blood is interesting for me versus, let's say, Legion of Night or Verkos Dynasty is that Neferata is the War Master into that subfaction, meaning that she is the additional general. For context, for those who don't know, not the additional general. She just follows a lot of all the rules that benefit general benefits her, except for some mechanics that require a chosen general. But for the most part, I want the list is that she unlocks her. She gets a double buff, and I think Neferata should be included in just like Manfred, in a lot of lists. Like in Verkos, you always see, if you see somebody play Verkos, it's probably because they're really like Shadakar or Radikar the Beast, whatever you want to call him. So you'll see him a lot in it. And if you see Legion of Night, it's because people are taking Manfred. If you see Legion of Blood, it's because people are going to take Neferata, right? It's like kind of like the sub-faction follows the War Master of it, in a sense, or the the iconic leader of it. But in this case, well, I guess it's not really this case. It's the same thing. I picked the sub-faction because I wanted to build the list around the sub-faction mechanics, not necessarily Neferata. She just happened to be like a very good, basically, element into it. At the core of the problem statement, when I first started approaching this list almost a year ago or 6 months ago, God, it's been a long time since I basically went 5-0 with it at Atlantic City. It's the first time I rocked it in public. It was the concept was basically we were in an environment in which a lot of armies at the time were hyper-aggressive melee armies. This was a day of basically Maggotkin all flies. This was the day of Iron Jaws, and the day of Dragons with hero phase move. Like we're talking like, yeah, this is like an environment in which it's high speed, high melee, high aggro, like super durable units. Now, a lot of problems with Soul Blight is that the army tends to be very kind of glass cannony. Like the things that do damage in the list are Grave Guards. And to be honest, it's kind of like the only thing that does a lot of like ridiculous damage. And when you think about like what they're in comparison to the other war scrolls in that book, but it didn't have any much staying power outside of their recursion mechanic or their respawn mechanic through grave sites. Now I wanted to create a version of that is where I was thinking, well, instead of trying to create, fight the fire that is the hyper aggro meta. Let's just try to do something, douse it with fire, douse it with basically water. So approach the list with thinking, well, Neferata has this really cool mechanic that basically the spell it makes a unit unrendable, if you want to think about it that way. It's mostly just the unit she blesses with it is basically ignores all negative modifiers, so they're safe. Makes him like ethereal, but better than ethereal. So because you can still apply modifiers like Mystic Shield and all out defense. But the really important thing is that like, okay, I can now engage things that punch really, really hard, because most of the time, most of the units we're fighting in the game were high rend, quality, high volume, not volume, high quality attacks, and not necessarily just basically all around mortal wound generation, right? It's just super punishing, basically in terms of like damage output. So there was the concept of having that mechanic around her, and the fact that Legion of Blood also had this really interesting mechanic, which was that if you're basically feeling a battle shock within 3 inches of a Legion of Blood vampire, you lose an extra D3 models in the battle shock. Once again, this is we're talking about an environment with hyper melee elite kind of builds, like dragons, Maggotkin, at the time Iron Jaws, like pigs. Like I wanted an army that basically says I can tank you, but I can't necessarily melee you. But if I do enough, just a little bit of damage, because of my bravery mechanic, I could just finish off units. That was a concept I was approaching the list with. There's a couple things that like really synergizes with it in just generalized Soulblight manner. All the Death Rattle and Deadwalker stuff basically lower bravery of units within 6 by 1, up to a max of 2 if they're in range of more than 1. So it becomes like, against Iron Jaws, it's like whether you're talking like bravery 5 on most of their units, Stormcast bravery 7 for most of their units. So, killing 1 or 2 models in those blocks, all of a sudden you basically completely kind of gut you could potentially gut the unit just because they failed the battle shock test. All of a sudden they lose another D3 models. It's 2 models. And I say gut, I mean, like, it just lets you finish the unit off, because the Blood Knights in the list are kind of the hammer / anvil mechanically, but the Grave Guards are really the hammer unit. But the approach is that it just gives you this weird way, not weird way, but this other way of dealing damage through basically battle shock and chip and damage, and still kind of like sticking around. All right, well, enough about like kind of like the ruse approach of like, well, what I started this, how I started this army. So I'm going to jump straight more into the actual list. And this is what I took to the Sparkle Death Party event over the weekend. All right, where are you? There we go. Okay, so we talked about it. It's Legion of Blood. So by Glarogue, Triumph is Bloodthirsty, which is pretty feasible to get most games because the list is in 1960. We talked about Neferata. Got a Vampire Lord for selling my only JC. And there's a lot of text below her, and you'll see why. She seems important. She is, but not that important. Look of Eye, which is kind of the change from the previous 2 times I've played this list in public, or I should say in a GT. 5 Black Knights, 2 units of 10 Death Rattle Skeletons, 10 Blood Knights, 20 Grave Guards, a Corpse Cart, and a Holy Lodestone. Okay, let's start dismantling. Oh, sorry, I forgot. Portal Piece, Horghast. Let's start dismantling kind of all the combos that go into this this army and the synergy behind it. All right. We talked about Neferata and her endless spell. Sorry, not endless spell. Her War Scroll spell. We talked about the bravery reduction, and the bravery mechanic if you're in combat with Legion of Blood vampires. Well, most people at face value, they look at, okay, it's got a Horghast. Prevents inspiring presence within 12, and it also causes another D3 models to run away if they feel battle shock. So you can kind of double dip into that mechanic. So you can get to 2D3 additional models. Unlike things like Stormcast, or Iron Jaws, or in some of the more recent meta, even against Gids to an extent, especially if you're playing against trolls, it can be really like devastating. Like Just like they lost maybe one or two models in combat, and then they don't have the way to inspire presence, and boom, they just lose like potentially 2 to 6 more models, and that just lifts the unit or finishes it off. So you can kind of see like, okay, I can see the battle shock mechanic is very important, seems important to list, and it's just like it seems that what it's built around. Not exactly. The actual what it is like one of the elements in the how I started building the list and approached it. The actual high value in this list is it's basically the control game that it plays. It no longer is about like just chipping damage and causing battle shock and forcing your opponent off the table through that. It also has this ability to basically project board presence very quickly, which is the form of the Black Knights. They're an amazing kind of moving screen. They're really annoying for some armies to just basically deal with without over committing more resources than they absolutely need to. And then you obviously have the Blood Knights behind, which are, really what the target for the, Neferata spell should, early in the game. Quickly, you only need it for one turn to be on the Blood Knights, and that's either turn 1 or turn 2. Because the idea of the Blood Knights is to engage as many of the threat targets on the table as possible from your opponent's army and just lock them into combat. While you'll let Neferata, Lokavi, the Grave Guards, basically target the soft, squishy flanking things that your opponent needs to score points. And this is where it goes really into why it's like a super punishing mechanic to aggressive armies, because a lot of those hyper aggressive armies don't have run retreat mechanics. They just don't. So having basically this way to just anchor them in the board, and hopefully not on points, because you don't really want to fight them on points anyway, with this pretty much nearly, if you don't have a spam of mortal wound output, just nearly unkillable block of Blood Knights. Against Gits and Trolls, it's very good. Against Monster Trucks, it's very good. Sorry, we call Monster Truck the Stonehorn list for OBR. Against Shooty Cannon list, it's also very good from OBR. Against KO, it could potentially be very good, especially even with the new KO, like depending on the archetype they're building. There's also the approach of it's good against even my Grave Fury list, or because it's just really actually surprising. I played it over the weekend and it just kind of raffle stomped it. Not because I think it's there's try to coach my buddy through how to play it against my Soul Blight list, but like there's a lot of mechanics in this that just really punishes like armies that want to dictate the game through melee. So I played so for context, I played Flesh Eater Court, fast melee army, which doesn't even care about my bravery mechanic at all. Then I played my friend with the Fire Slayer list with all Grimwrath and Gotrek and so forth, which once again, bravery reduction doesn't matter. There's no units to take advantage of that. Then I played that Stonehorn list. Once again, bravery mechanic doesn't matter. Then I finally played it into Gits, Squid Gits. And this is where the true test for the list was going to be like, can it handle the speed and mortal wound potential output of the Gits? And what I discovered is, while I was playing this, is that there is a lot of ways by forcing the Gits player to have overextended squid units, you can super punish them because of certain elements like Lokavi and Neferata in the list. And then finally, I played a cities list, which was Louis Philippe's Hello Hard list, and that was probably the hardest matchup I had. Even though the game was solidly in my lead early on, it was still very hard to deal with, just mostly because the amount of mortal wound he can put out in that list between the Quicksilver Sword, the Hurricanum, range mortal wounds, the spell, the comet, and so forth. It was the one list that was actually significantly problematic for this archetype, because the Blood Knights need to be able to completely like ignore damage effectively as much as possible to be relevant enough to lock your opponent's units into, or at least the melee ones, into combat. And against this more shooting one, it's to be able to engage, remove things, and not die to all the other mechanics. So Uh, maybe I'll talk a little bit more about like the decisions being every kind of picks into this. So we kind of went over Neferata. Couple things I will point out to the audience here today. She did manage to lift like three heroes, I think, with the insta slay mechanic. One of the things I discovered is when you tell like an OBR player about the insta slay mechanic, or even a chaos player that brought Archeon or some meaty heroes, they play very differently than they would play normally because they probably look at a Soulblight list. They're just like, just ram it in, see what happens. But when you tell them Nephrotic can like insta slay a hero if you take any move from the Dagger of Jet on a 5-up, they play a very different game. Like it's more like, let's not throw that guy or any guys near Neferata, because she's going to be so cocooned behind screens that like you can't get to her unless you can shoot her off. So that was a nice little like discovery and like the mental framework of some of my opponents about how to deal with Neferata. Like the Terra guy, some of my deflect player was just like, he saw Neferata across, he's just like, I guess I'm just not going unga bunga with the fleshy my Terra guys and just charging as fast as possible. Um, and then the other kind of like nitpick pieces, but net tech piece I picked was for her spell. Now most of the time I used to take the Crap 5, but since I don't have Manfred in this list for her, with her I just take Fading Vigor, which proved to be the right pick over the period the weekend. Being able to basically lower attack counts on Squig Herd is massive. And if you roll that double nine, that 9 for the Lord Shaiish spell cast mechanic, like you can basically affect get it off twice, and that can be like super crippling for squig herds to just be at like that much modified attacks, or really like even Stonehorns. Like, oh yeah, let's talk about this. So I'm smiling because like I hope to God my opponent Andrew Hare didn't quit Warhammer because his Stonehorns were hitting off 5s. Her command ability is another punishing mechanic against melee armies. She has an aura of 12 inches for my units wholly within it to be -1 to hit in melee. So not only does that super punish Stonehorns, it also super punishes Gits. Even though the mortal wound Gits don't really care as much because they trigger on 6s, what was like the volume of damage they're doing with those is maybe 7 to 10 mortal wounds consistently, in some cases more, and that's killing 3 blood knights, maybe 4 blood knights on average. But the problem is like all of their regular damage just can't go through the 2-up rend, or the fact you made them rend 0 because of Locovia's aura, or the fact that they're minus attacks, which really greatly reduces their output. Like the combo, the -1 to hit on 4 plus to hit platforms that can't necessarily always get +1 to hit is super problematic for those armies to deal with. And that's what I discovered in my Squid matchup, is that like that her ability to just to kind of completely shut down the melee prowess of armies was very apparent in every one of the games. Not only that, she's also a 16-inch moving platform that can kind of snipe out like JCs. Like she picked up Skagrok in my game against Dale with his Squig Herd. She picked up a ton of Grim Wraths in my matchup against the Greyfjord list for my buddy, and then she also picked up the Flesh Eater Quartz Terrorgeist. Granted, like it was overkill, but it was just like mechanically speaking, her speed, her synergy is like she's just an all-star in the list, and she feels like the centerpiece. But she like it's like the list doesn't break apart because she died. Like she died at all. But she does feel like you can use her as a way to also like absorb any shell. In worst case you can always cast her spell on herself. She heals D6 when she kills, when she triggers the hunger. She's mechanically speaking, she's just super. She does everything very well. Being level 2 caster and so forth. I keep feeling like I'm talking. It's been 20 minutes of me talking about how amazing Neferata is. So I guess this is an homage to, our current Neferata, who might not be the same exactly. I would imagine her next iteration will probably make her beefier, but she will, like the unrendable spell is probably going to get a change to either ethereal or just reduction of rend on target, on whatever targets that those units. Anyway, What does the Vampire Lord do in the list? Well, the Vampire Lord is the JC, so he just lets you score those battle tactics. The additional mechanic, what he brings is the arcane expertise, which means that the first spell and unbind, the spell he does, is +2 on the roll, which is super useful in when you're trying to also kind of like counter some magic, like for example, Squigs countering Squiggler or countering the teleport spell. So that way your opponent can't teleport Skagrok into a position to just basically use his nasty spell to do something or teleport a unit. Like being able to shut down magic is pretty important. That's why she also has Master Magic. Now there's some great command traits in Legion of Blood. It's just that his job is to basically be the anchor for it's to get the point for cunning maneuver, and then to just basically prevent your opponent from or pushing through the Orgas or prevent your opponent from getting a certain key spell off effectively. She the one you notice I gave her because in my army it's a woman vampire. She has levitate, so some people will probably think this is cheeky, but as far as I understand, this is a totally legal maneuver. And when I say maneuver, is that you can cast levitate on the Blood Knights, and the Blood Knights March of Ruin mechanic is you can, if you're in combat, you can activate the March of Ruin, which allows you to basically move out of combat and recharge. And if the second portion of that rule is that if you pass over any models while you do that move, on a 2-up they take D3 mortal wounds. And the condition they added as like a third condition to the rule was that they can pass over models that have wound characters of 3 or less. Levitate, since you gets you the fly keyword, when you march March of Ruin, you can basically ignore any model when you move. It doesn't matter what their wound characteristic is. So I was using it mostly to just sometimes do some chip damage here and there on the heroes or the units I was stuck in combat with, that maybe not 3 wounds or more, but also just giving Blood Knights the ability to fly just means it's a lot easier to maneuver them around certain things. It's a fairly easy spell to cast, between it's for especially for that Vampire Lord, because she's +2 natively on the first spell she casts and +1 for the corpse card. So that really helps you push that spell through. The Total Master is mostly for just getting cunning maneuver, but also getting her in range for her command ability for the Graveguards. She is not part of the Bat Reg, or she is part of the Galatian Command, because the Graveguards in the Galatian Command. And the reason for that is not so much for the double activate mechanic, if you bottom the turn with JC and their Swarm Protectors. It's to literally open up a Matter of Honor battle tactic. It allows you to basically use the Graveguards to hunt down JCs for that battle tactic. And they're very good at killing JCs, so it just unlocks an additional battle tactic you can score with the list. And you're not sacrificing much, because you have so many screens you can set up that like going second or first doesn't really matter. So losing the prior roll is not that super important for you, or not choosing to go first or second doesn't really matter in this list. What matters is getting to choose who goes second or third, or controlling, or basically forcing your opponent in a situation where if he does go second or third, he doesn't get much value because he's stuck fighting Blood Knights that's unrendable. And even if the Blood Knights are not unrendable, you could still give them most likely, Mystic Shield. You could still land all out defense on them. We're not finding that many monsters where Roar is like a super thing you have to worry about too much. So even just having +2 save on Blood Knights is basically borderline, almost as equally as good as having unrendable. And the cherry on top is, by having Local Vi there, you can also basically use her aura to reduce rend for enemy units within 3 to just really additionally basically like make it so like they're almost unrendable in that case. So there is a fallback in case you don't get that spell off, like you don't necessarily need it. And that's why I kind of like built this redundancy into the army. Lokabai is the reason I picked her is not so much for I could have taken a regular Vangorian note to get that value, but Lokabai adds a couple things that I like in the current meta. First, she's a monster, which means she's really there to help you smash or roar targets or stomp targets and smash terrain. And, being the Loon Shrine, the Maw Pod, like some of the newer like faction terrains are very useful for certain armies. So like being able to smash them is important, and she'll be even more useful once Khorne and Slaanesh for the exact same reason. So cool, another fast monster to get to do that with. She also has Impactus, where she does mortal wounds on a 5-up based like Stonehorns and Ogres. And sometimes that's good enough to push through damage to free up another unit out of like Neferata out of combat, or to just basically kill a support hero or JC. Like, it's really, she can like get her, grubby hands into like a squid boss from just charging. She usually just lifts the squid boss and you can pile in and fight somewhere else. So I like having like this, having one of these mechanics in the army. Like, that's why I love my KO Dealbreaker Ram or the new frigate like Assault Rams. It's just having mortal wounds on the charge mechanic lets you basically apply pressure at a new angle that doesn't exist, that your opponent might not be ready for effectively, or isn't, taking that into account. And finally, the big reason why I take Lokabai is for the theme of this, which is control. Her spell is an aura of 12 inches, and any enemy unit that wants to make a charge with it is that aura halves their charge distance. Now, it's a hard spell to get off. It's cast value 8, but you got the corpse card there to give you +1. And if she does get that spell off, it is absolutely devastating, especially in a squid matchup, because the squid herds cannot reroll charges like at all. So making like just having that aura up and just one redeploy, you could basically put the squid army just on this holding pattern. Like, I guess we failed the charge, and then it lets your army kind of go wild about like positioning and taking control where you need to be on objectives. Like, it doesn't have the output to straight up kill a squig herd, but it does have the output to try to basically remove the support pieces of the squig herd. So the next turn that the squig herd goes, that player goes, you see the squig herd unit is out of range of his support pieces, or he's just he's out of them. Another reason why she has Spirit Gale is a spell that basically does mortal wounds based on the difference in the 2d6 roll and the bravery value of an enemy unit. And once again, redundancy of mechanics here. You got the -2 bravery from the death rattle units in the army that can basically cause that to push some mortal wounds through. And it's another Lord Shaiish spell, so you could trigger it off twice on the 9+. It was kind of a techie pick in case I had to lift like a Winded Squig boss or like any of the Gits heroes, really, because you can do some decent mortal wounds on him. It's just like a few, a fairly decent roll on the bravery chalk. I don't think it happened at all the entire weekend. I was mostly casting her War Scroll spell or just Arcane Bolt, but it didn't really matter because like I was using her for the other thing, which was like in case Neferata spell doesn't go off or Neferata takes a spell because the Blood Knights are out of range. That she can help support the Blood Knights into like adding that extra durability. And I love her just having her first war as well. She's a great piece for that. And surprise, surprise, she also has a bunch of 3-inch attacks. Like the attack profile is not that great, but it's sometimes nice to have to be able to engage, basically engage things behind the Blood Knights and nobody can get to them, to that target basically. So, and let me give you a context. So I'm going to pull it up on the app here about how like lackluster attack profiles are. Because I don't think she's ever killed me almost anything in my games by attacking, and it's actually one of the highlights, and this is why I'm bringing it up. So Lokabai, and as a context, 12-inch movement, does not degrade. She's a monster that doesn't degrade. 11 wounds, so she's one above a Rangorian Lord. 3-up save, bravery 10. She has a Rapier, which is 1-inch reach, 4 attacks, 3s and 3s, and rend 1, 2 damage. And then Talons, which are 3 attacks, 4 to hit, 3 to win, 1 rend, d6 damage. But they're 3-inch reach, so that's cool. And then Knee Peeling Tail, which is 1-inch reach, d6, 4+4+, no rend, 1 damage. And here's why her sucking profile mattered. in my matchup against Dale, he tried to snipe at my Vampire Lord by engaging my screen and pulling the Black Knights and pulling some units into combat to try to make me kill some squigs, so he would then have squigs flee, so then he could use them to snipe out the Vampire Lord. And the reason why I couldn't position her 9 inches away from the screen, so he could do that on the flee, was because it was the only piece of terrain that was ignoring that blocking line of sight from Scabrock's Mortal Wound spell. So I couldn't. It's either I put myself in a way where Skyrock can teleport and do that spell on her, or I position myself in a tree and try to body block through redeploy his ability to do those squigs. So he went in doing that. He engaged like the Blood Knights, the Black Knights, Lokabai, and I did not stomp. Chose not to stomp because I knew that was what his gamble was. And then my Black Knights like completely whiffed. No one used all attack. Lokavai's shitty attack profile, I think, killed maybe 1 or 2 squid because they had a 5-up ward. And then the Blood Knights that he pulled in, I only had 1 in range to swing, so I chose to not pile in all the other ones into melee range of the fighting range of the squigs, because once again, me complaining about Blood Knights not having more than like a bloody 1-inch reach was working in my favor because I didn't get to swing more attacks than I needed to into the squig. So he still managed to have 7 of them flee because of the Legion of Blood mechanic, because I was stuck within 3 inches of him. And he still flailed the battle shock, obviously. So that came back to bite me in the But luckily enough, between him rolling 2 1s and me rolling 1-6 on the shrug save, the Vampire Lord survived, and with 1 wound and managed to get the hell out of Dodge. So so sometimes you gotta take your shitty, or I guess your lackluster ability to hit into in a ways to help you in the way. I think there was for an example, Go Tracker with the reroll mechanic. I think I use it to reroll into misses a couple times to prevent me from killing, to deny somebody's battle tactics. So I know it's like super ass backward for some people to think about that, but like it's just like, what's the value of you rolling bad, right? Like there is actually a value to that in the game. So, and vice versa. Like in the next matchup, I picked a Matter of Honor where I had an auto charge guaranteed to like 3 or 4 grave guards into one of his JC, and I didn't want to risk it that they couldn't kill it. So I was like, well, I'll have Lokavai charge, and she's 9 inches away from him. So if she fails, whatever. If she makes it, it's like 3 mortal wounds. If she rolls a 9 on average. Then I rolled an 11, and then I proceeded to roll God tier like 5-ups, and he took like 7 mortal wounds and got lifted, and I failed my battle tactic. So don't do what I did is also the moral of the story. Anyway, we're already at the 33-minute mark. All right. Take a little sippy sip. All right. So I'm probably boring all of you guys with this explanation, but I get a lot of feedback saying people really like the long form breakdown of things. So I'm trying to give the people what they want. All right. Now, Black Knights, we talked about them. I love them. I love their mortal wound mechanic from charging. I love their, like, when you bring them back as 3 models, which is the perfect amount to deny or take an objective away from a single JC. So they're fast. They're great mobile screen. They're honestly like not that bad in combat either. Like, I mean, they're not great. Like, don't get me wrong about that, but they're not that bad. But one of the things that really benefits them in a Legion of Blood mechanic, other than the fact that it makes them battle line, is the sub-faction mechanic for Legion of Blood also allows them to ignore negative modifiers to hit and wound as long as they're in a certain range of a different type of vampire. It's like 18 for general, 12 for other ones. But or Legion of Blood vampires to be specific, so not Lokabai, for example. But the important thing is that, like, in some matchups, like, that made a difference. Like, having my opponent had -1 to wound on, like, his Stonehorn or something, or I forgot which monster of his he did, and I was like, sorry, it doesn't do anything. They're too close to that other vampire there. And not like I don't think they did any damage, but like it's kind of cool to have that. And the reason why I bring it up is because the Graveguards benefit from that sub-faction. They are a Death Rattle unit, and usually there's a vampire nearby. So basically, having this ability to completely Like I think in my matchup against Dale, he was trying. I forgot which kit spell he was doing, but he was trying to do something on them to give them -1 to be hit or something. And I'm like, doesn't affect the grave guards, and that was super nice. So that's a kind of like it's a niche synergy, but it's a synergy nonetheless. And that's I would say like how the entire list is not designed. It's got through multiple iterations. One of the original ones of Manfred over Lokovai didn't have a corpse guard, but that had cogs, but then the endless spells point changes and so forth and so forth. But through the iterational steps and the change, the evolution of the game, it still plays very much like a control list, and it super punishes aggressive melee armies. And I got very lucky during my weekend. That's basically all I played was aggressive melee armies. And I played also a lot of armies of a lot of heroes. And guess who does a really good job at killing heroes? Third of the time, Neferata. It was really nice being like swinging into one unit, just throwing the dagger into and the single hero that she was in combat with, and just like, all right, we'll see if he dies. So, and for the most part, like I will say, like I don't think I can make a better Soul Blight list or just list in general in terms of synergistic measures. Everything in that army is just like buffs another mechanic in the list, and there's a lot of overlapping and completely independent also as well mechanics that are like super important. And in all of them, these moving parts allow you to make it a very one-sided matchup, especially if you're playing against a player who might not understand like all these overlapping and independent like mechanics. And I wouldn't say it's a gotcha mechanic because I'm always very explicit about my opponents about, hey, this this that this like, and I think maybe it plays a role into why it does so well. Like when you tell somebody like Neferata can instant slay heroes on a 5-up, she does any single wound with a 5 attack, 3s and 3s, sorry, 2s and 3s, -1 rend 1 damage weapon. Yeah, they they play a little bit differently. Like they see and they're like, well, how fast does she move? Like, well, she's 5, she's 16-inch movement that degrades, and they're like, huh. She pretty much gets anywhere on the table, and if you once you anchor your foot down, the Blood Knights in the center, and they screen for her, and so forth. So the list just feels a little bit of a bully. I'll be honest when it comes to these super aggressive matchups. And in my matchup against Dale, what killed the first Squig unit was that it failed to do what it was trying to do in the first turn, and then was out of range of its subsequent buff, like the ward save, the mortal wound, and so forth. That like effectively just a bunch of chip damage between Lokovai and, or not chip damage, a bunch of damage from Lokovai and the Blood Knights recharging into him, because I was able to engage multiple units with them after that turn, or after his first turn gamble. Was like it went through, it started chewing them through up very quickly. And this is a piece of advice I tell for everybody who plays against Gits. Like, you shouldn't be focusing on trying to kill the Squig herds. You should be focusing on managing the Squig herds. And what I mean by that is keep them low model count. Don't try to kill them. If you can prevent them from being rolled as long as possible on the Loon Shrine, you're doing great. If they come back on turn 3, turn 4, it sucks, but they're more likely than not to get that much value out of them. It's okay to let them roll on the herders to come back, because once things at a time, the herder's going to die. And I guess it sucks to be in an environment where you feel like you can't enjoy the game, or you're in a situation where like killing them feels more punishing than not. But this army doesn't care about killing them. Like the Blood Knights can just keep retreating and re-engaging as much as they want, and keeping them locked fighting the Blood Knights. And the important part was to try to get to the juicy like buff pieces, and that's what your shop should be against Gits, Squig, especially Squig Herder Gits, is to remove the support pieces. Because of Dale's first turn gamble, it opened up a gap for Neferata to pick up Skagrok and also get in melee range of the Gobapalooza while still maintaining the 12-inch aura on the Blood Knights, because Skagrok had to move so far forward to make that squid unit be able to reach my back line on the first turn, or charge me my line on the first turn. So it exposed them effectively, and he didn't have enough ways to create a nice barrier between the rest of my army and Skagrok and the Gobapalooza. So mechanically speaking, like they're yes, squids are incredibly good, uh, but there is ways to not say counter them, but to play against them, and there I think it's just going to require people to feel it out a bit longer. I don't know if this is the list that beat Squid, but it had a game plan. It executed to that game plan, and it beat Squigs. And I would say it beat Squid against, I would say, a very competitive and competent Squid player. Now, is that something I would say is indicative of, this archetype maybe being like, I'm being my archetype, this more controlling archetype being the way to counter this type of army and going forward? Yes. Is this archetype going to exist going forward? I don't know, with the new Soulblight book, but there's a lot of other armies that do something similar, like the Zinj book will do something. You can do something similar with the Zinj book, and you can also play the game very, like I think KO will also have a much easier time against Squig herds because it has some controlling approach to the game, and also just a lot more output against them. And then finally, there is there probably I'm imagining that Hedonites Sinesh would also have a lot of like similar play. You could probably play them to kind of that controlly matchup. So I don't know. Moral of the story is I really love this list. I hope I see more people play it, but I get why more people don't play it. It's very technical. Also, it's a super pain in the ass to move around a unit of 10 Blood Knights with the coherency issues. Like, it was such a Rubik's Cube every game to try to make a charge, keep them on any coherency. Also, thinking about, like, what would happen if one or two died? Like, am I going to be breaking the coherency rule? Do I have to lift models? Uh, but you have to think about it. Even if that happens, it's okay. Like, you can just retreat and then just rally during their turn and maybe get a one or two back or not. Like, as long as they don't die, like they're not, like, their job is to literally shut down your opponent's ability to dictate engagements for the first half of the game. And then if they die in the second half of the game, you're probably still winning the game because your battle tactics are fairly easy between cunning maneuver turn one. Then you can do the hunger, which is trigger the hunger of two of your vampire heroes, like or your general one time, which is a fairly easy battle tactic. Then there's the Colossus Overlord, which I failed. One of my only two battle tactics I dropped that weekend was Colossus Overlord because my charged them into a Thunder Tusk and was under the illusion that it probably could kill them, and I didn't even have the ward save up, and it just he didn't. Like, I think he only killed like one. So, and then like I was like, cool, failed my battle tactic. But like most of the time, like when those Black Knights respawn 3-man units, they're very easy for you to just like suicide them into something and to get Colossus Overlord. So it's another very good, easy battle tactic to achieve. And then obviously they can do Desecrate very easily at any point. They can do gaining momentum very easily, and then you also have a Matter of Honor that's unlocked through this build. So like in terms of battle tactics, this army has some fairly easy battle tactics. We're not talking like Gitz level or KO level easy, but it has a lot of like good easy battle tactics you can do. And then finally, its grand strategy is also fairly easy, but it requires you to plan that ahead. So the grand strat is you have to control more grave sites, and grave sites are control like objectives than your opponent at the end of the game. And if you're losing the game, you're probably losing that grand strat, which sucks, but you're losing the game. But if you're winning the game, like you're almost guaranteed to score that grand strategy. And then even if you're losing, you can still play to get that grand strat. Like it's not like an auto lose for it, but you have to play to it. So like my recommendation for that is I always place the two of them in my territory, like in a place where they will be useful for center objectives, but like too far back from my opponent to really, and not an objective. So that way my opponent wants to contest or control an objective of mine or my side, he doesn't necessarily get to contest and control one of my grave sites. But that grave, if anybody unit comes out of that grave site, it could reach that objective. or be in the threat range of it. And then I usually deploy one gravesite in the center of the board, just because I know my Blood Knights are going to be throughout most of the game fighting over the center of the board anyway. And then one of the other gravesite will be like somewhere challenging or threatening one of my opponent's, one or two objectives, but never on top of the objectives. Usually off to the side between both of them, just so that way, he's not necessarily thinking about like fighting, or micromanaging the gravesite, meaning that he's not putting units on top of it. He just knows that if I come off, like he's just going to put units around the edge of the objective, or models to prevent me from getting on the objective. But if I do get a unit off it, means he's also not sitting within 6 inches of the objective, meaning that if I do come up from that gravesite, I am claiming that especially during their turn at the end of the battle shock phase. I get to claim that gravesite, and they don't get to challenge it during their turn. So it requires some planning, but it's a very easy grand strategy to score. Okay, 45 minutes. I've only had one sip. Don't think I said basically too many times. It probably came up a few times. 2 sips now. And I want to say that I really enjoyed breaking down this army. And I'm sure people have more questions about it. And I'm sorry to say that it probably won't be legal, or this build will hopefully still be legal or work in the next iteration of the book in 3 weeks. Thank you so much for watching. And once again, I strive to do better and not have an episode out of cycle on the Sunday release. All right, guys. See you around and enjoy the rest of your week.